Chapter 17, the Endocrine System, Screencast 3. We're now going to be focusing on the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and also the hormones that are primarily associated with the pituitary. Now, the master area is going to be the hypothalamus. We addressed this previously, in which the hypothalamus is kind of the bridge between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic system. So we also have to keep in mind here is that it is going to be the bridge between the nervous system and the endocrine system also. So overall, the hypothalamus is a really important area of the brain. And as noted, the hypothalamus will be controlling the pituitary, and quite often the pituitary is referred to as the master gland. It is a pea-sized organ which is inferior and the most inferior aspect of the brain, and we can kind of see that here, okay? And so it's relatively small. It's pea-sized. In some of our older brain models, it actually looked like a flesh-colored M&M. It's going to be connected to the hypothalamus by a stalk that's known as the infundibulum. Now, the important thing to remember here is that the pituitary is actually subdivided into two different structures. One is going to be the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. Now, one of the biggest differences between the anterior and posterior is the connection that they actually share with the hypothalamus. The connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary will be a neural connection, whereas the connection between the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus will actually be a vascular connection. And that makes a really, really big difference. So here we can actually see the posterior pituitary. It's actually the smallest portion of the pituitary gland. And once again, there are actually going to be connections, neurons coming from the hypothalamus that are projecting through the infundibulum, and they are actually releasing the hormones into the posterior pituitary. So keep in mind, the posterior pituitary does not produce hormones. The hypothalamus is actually producing the hormones, and it's transmitting those hormones to the posterior pituitary through the neural connection that's shared. The two hormones that we associate with the posterior pituitary are going to be oxytocin and ADH. Now, here we see a little bit more clearly the significant relationship between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. And notice we have what we refer to as the hypothalamus epiphyseal tract. So that's the neural connection. And what we're going to see is the synthesis of ADH and oxytocin within the hypothalamus. And once again, they are going to be transported and released by the posterior pituitary when the signals are appropriate. So keep in mind here, we are not going to see the posterior pituitary actually producing any hormones. Now, one of the main aspects of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary is the fact that the hypothalamus is actually producing and releasing a number of releasing and inhibiting factors. These are going to be moving on to the anterior pituitary, and this is going to result in either the release or the inhibition of the hormones of the anterior pituitary. And those are thyroid-stimulating hormone, prolactin, follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, and growth hormone. So notice here, there are no hormones transmitted from the hypothalamus and stored within the anterior pituitary. You have factors that are either going to release or inhibit the release of hormones that are produced in the anterior pituitary. And remember, they're also going to be released from there. Now, if we look at two hormones of the posterior pituitary, we're going to be looking at ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. So as noted, these are packaged in secretory vesicles within the hypothalamus, and they're transported through fast axonal transport, and they're going to be released from the synaptic knobs into the blood when neurons actually fire impulses. So antidiuretic hormone also known as vasopressin. It actually will decrease urine production, stimulate thirst, and will result in vasoconstriction. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is a hormone that is responsible for uterine contractions, the ejection of milk, and also emotional bonding. Now, as noted, quite often you may see those release or inhibiting factors that are produced by the hypothalamus as regulatory hormones. That is a valid name for them, as they're responsible for regulating the release or non-release of hormones of the anteropituitary. And so keep in mind, these regulatory hormones or factors are going to travel from the hypothalamus to the anteropituitary through portal blood vessels. Now here, we're looking at the primary hormones that are associated with the anteropituitary. Now please note, you're not going to be responsible for the various growth release factors or inhibiting factors that are coming from the hypothalamus. That's something to keep in mind here. So when we look at thyroid stimulating hormone, this is a tropic hormone that is going to be responsible for stimulating the thyroid to actually release thyroid hormone. Prolactin will actually act on the mammary glands to influence glandular growth and stimulating the production of milk. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, their target will be the gonads. And keep in mind, even though they are named after phases of the ovarian cycle, they still are going to be found in males and females, and their impact is going to be on function of the testes and also regulating hormones that are produced by the testes. Growth hormone really does just that. We're basically going to look at the release of insulin growth factors, and this actually will act synergistically with growth hormone on body tissues, especially cartilage, bone, and muscle, and its primary function is to result or promote growth. Then the last of the anteropituitary hormones is adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, and this will actually act on the adrenal cortex. Now keep in mind, not the adrenal medulla. And the impact on the cortex of the adrenal glands is to cause the release of glucocorticoids, the most common actually being cortisol. Now, when we look at growth hormone, as noted, one of the things that it's going to do is stimulate the release of IGFs, or insulin growth factors, from the liver. They act very similar to growth hormone, but they actually have a longer half-life. Now, keep in mind, all cells in our body have receptors for both growth hormone and insulin growth factors. Now, what this hormone will actually stimulate is an increase in protein synthesis, cell division, and cell differentiation. So we're also actually going to see the release of nutrients from storage. And this kind of makes sense. We basically need to have energy to fuel everything that is happening due to growth hormone. And so we're going to see glycogenolysis. This is the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. That's going to be stimulated. We're going to see gluconeogenesis. That is the conversion of nutrients that have a carbon skeleton into glucose. This is going to be stimulated. Glycogenesis, this is going to be inhibited. Lipolysis will be stimulated, whereas lipogenesis will be inhibited. So here, I want to spend some time with this particular diagram because we're going to see this for all the hormones we are going to be addressing. So first, we're going to look at the stimulus. And when we look at the stimuli that are going to influence the release of growth hormone, we're going to be looking at how much growth hormone there is, the age of the person, the time of day, the nutrient levels within the blood, and also stress and exercise. So the receptor, the hypothalamus, will respond to various stimuli as noted above. And then the control center, which is the hypothalamus, it's going to be releasing those factors that primarily are responsible for the release of growth hormone, and that is GHRH. Then, in response to GHRH, the anterior pituitary will release growth hormone. Growth hormone stimulates the hepatocytes to release insulin-like growth factors, and both growth hormone and insulin growth factors are going to stimulate the target cells. Examples, as noted previously, are going to be bone, muscle, and cells. So this is how we're going to see an increase in growth. This is due to the increased intake of amino acids, this causing protein synthesis. It may stimulate cellular division. It may stimulate cell differentiation. The net impact here is stimulating growth processes. Now, the other thing we have to take a look at are what is happening to energy-yielding molecules. So here we can see what's happening within the liver. There's going to be an increase in glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis, yet a decrease in glycogenesis. When we look at adipose tissue, it's basically going to be releasing glycerol and fatty acids. So the other side of growth hormone is actually to increase nutrients in the blood to support the underlying growth. Now, factors that actually influence growth hormone are going to be age. As we get older, we're typically going to see less growth hormone being produced. The other factor is growth hormone is one of those hormones that is impacted by circadian rhythms. So what we're really looking at here is a sleep-day cycle. And so that is something else that's going to have an impact overall on growth hormone. And we can basically see it start to increase, up to midnight, and then it starts to drop a little bit as we sleep, and then really drop down during the day before levels start to increase again. Now, there are a couple of disorders that are associated with growth hormone. One, a deficiency which will result in pituitary dwarfism. This is generally due to not enough growth hormone being produced. This could be due to an issue with the hypothalamus or the pituitary, and this is going to result in a short stature and hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. The opposite of having too much will be pituitary gigantism. And now this is excessive growth. It's going to result in hyperglycemia. And the issue here is the enormous size of internal organs. And if this is not treated, this will actually result in death at a relatively early age. Now here, we're actually looking at acromegaly. Now what this is an excessive production of growth hormone in an adult. Now if we look at the images here, you may find it hard to believe, but this is actually the same person before acromegaly and after. And so when we see what's happening within an adult, we're going to see an enlargement of bones, of face, hands, and feet. There's going to be an increase in the release of glucose. So this actually means we're going to see hyperglycemia. We saw that with pituitary gigantism. There's going to be a greater size of internal organs. And once again, this is generally due to failure of the normal negative feedback mechanism responsible for regulating the levels of growth hormone in the body.